Well, I think I always saw them getting in trouble, and I was so afraid of getting in trouble and meeting that wrath. So that was one thing. I also have a very close friend who she's been one of my closest friends since like third grade. I would spend a lot of time at their house. I spent a lot of time at Patty's house, and they set sh her mom and stepdad set a lot of boundaries for me, and I had a lot of protection from them on and sort of guidance on what's right and wrong. And but I know it was instilled. I don't know. It wasn't instilled in me by my parents, I don't think, but I think more from Patty's parents of right and wrong. And I just always knew that I would go to high school and graduate and go to college and have a career and maybe someday get married and have kids and buy a house. Just all the regular things that I felt like you were supposed to do. And I'm not exactly sure where that came from, but that was just never a question in my mind to drop out of high school at any age or to do drugs, um, or to smoke cigarettes or to be violent with people. That just, I don't know. It's just something different in me. I don't exactly know where it came from.
That's Sadie Johnson, a woman whose shocking discovery of a secret transformed her understanding of her family. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. Sadie Johnson found a shocking discovery that changed her understanding of her family through a search on the DNA registry website 23andMe. She had expected to find distant relatives and instead discovered a family secret, a nephew she never knew existed. That discovery led her to a woman she would later come to believe was drugged and raped by her brother. The conversation transformed into something that's become the beginning of healing for both Sadie and an unexpected relationship between the two and her newly discovered nephew. Sadie grew up in a family where violence, secrecy, misogyny, and emotional neglect were normalized, where her parents' refusal to talk about many things, mental illness, abuse, addiction, grief, created a family system where trauma was inherited, not addressed. The brother Sadie suspected of rape had been murdered in 1998 during a $20 crack deal at a time where he was deep in addiction and a dealer tried to rob him. Yet the family's myths persisted. At home, as a child, adolescent, and young adult, Sadie internalized her fear, leading to a hypervigilance and belief that love must be earned. She would go on to build a stable adult life despite her upbringing, not because of it. Yet she carries grief, guilt, and a quiet ache for belonging that isn't always visible on the surface. Following the discovery of her nephew, Sadie has begun excavating her past, trying to understand the reasons she did not repeat the cycle, reckoning with the fact that she could have passed on the damage she inherited and the anxiety that she felt as she raised her own children, worried that she would pass on that trauma. Sadie's life is a story about breaking generational trauma, but also one of trying to understand it. In 2021, Sadie got back to her artistic roots and opened a paint-it-yourself pottery studio called Brookside Ceramics in Kansas City, Missouri. However, before going back to that work, she was a writer and an editor for newspapers and magazines and in marketing for nearly 3 decades. In many ways, storytelling comes naturally to her, and it's the reckoning with her family and its influence on who she became and who she did not become. That's the next chapter. So, Sadie, I just wanted to thank you for joining me. I know, you became a listener of the podcast, and we had an awesome opportunity to meet last year at CrimeCon in Denver. And you've opened up to me a little bit about your journey and your family. And, I think, your journey and your story touches upon so many things that I think we don't talk about. And by that, I mean, when I was a young journalism student at the University of Maryland, I had a professor, Judith Hillman Patterson, and she had written a book called Sweet Mystery, a book of remembering. And, if you met Judith on any day, you would just think of her as, a woman in her 50s, probably at that time, you know, sweet, bubbly personality, really interesting ideas or thoughts. But her memoir explored her family. And Judith grew up in Appalachian, Alabama.
Ah,
And it explored her family and all the things that we don't talk about when it comes to family. And I remember in meeting her and reading her memoir, that really struck me because for completely different reasons, there's a whole segment of my father's family where we just don't talk about things. And it's not necessarily because anyone in that particular case did anything bad, but a lot of bad things have happened to the family. And
mhm,
one of the methods that they've developed to manage it is just not talking about it.
mhm,
And I think when we don't talk about things, you know, we all, the future generations, lose out. I can think of so many times in my life, I think of mental health stuff, and I remember when I when I went in and first got diagnosed with bipolar, I filled out that form, the medical history form, and it's like, anybody with depression, no. Anybody with bipolar, no. Anybody with
mhm,
anxiety, no. And then when I was finally diagnosed, my relatives were like coming out of the woodwork on my mother's side of the family, with their own stories and their own diagnoses. And when we
mhm,
don't talk about these experiences, I really do believe in that phrase that we're doomed to repeat them. And we're not handing people the tools that they need to to be able to live healthy lives. So I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate your willingness to be vulnerable too.
Thank you, Jason. It's such a fun time to, talk with you. No, it's not actually a fun time. It's an interesting conversation that we're definitely gonna have, but it's always fun to talk to you under any circumstance because, you're just so pleasant, and, I think I told you this once before, at any opportunity, I will try to get you to laugh because you have the most infectious laugh. You
Thank
really
you for
did.
that.
And, it just I think it sets people at ease, so and you do just in general, so thanks for having me.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's I can't think of a better compliment when what you do is interviews, when someone says you're present. And I do my best too, because I think that sometimes, clearing your head and really listening to people, you hear 10 times more than just sort of what can be taken from the surface of their words. And, I wanted to start because every sort of family story, every one of our stories is tangled. Um, but remember and hearing and you sharing with me about your family.
Mhm,
One particular story just really stuck out to me, and that was the story of your brother, Johnny, and Amy.
mhm,
And I think in listening and hearing that story, because it obviously involved genetic genealogy and finding out something, all the people I know who have found brothers and sisters and an assortment of other things through it, but you found something much worse than that, a family secret. Do you
mhm.
mind sharing that story?
Well, I did 23andMe a few years ago, and I was more interested in finding my family, thinking I would find my family who would be older than me, maybe cousins that I didn't know about, um, or aunts and uncles that I may not have known about. But what I found was a nephew, Kyle, and I was at this point, I can't even say words about it, but I was shocked. I was baffled, and I knew the percentages were that he was a nephew, but then I had to go back in my brain and try and think about that time in 1995. Okay, which one of my 3 older siblings, I have 2 brothers and a sister, which one of my 3 older siblings would have had a child in March of '96? So it would have been a relationship that would have been during the summer of '95. And I didn't live in Northern Kentucky anymore. I had moved to Kansas City. So I was here, and so I didn't actually see, and I'd always kind of been estranged from my siblings anyway, because they're, talk about a tangled mess. They were s so much different than me, and, um, so I found Kyle on 23andMe, and then it took a couple of months, but I found his mom, um, and it turns out it's her name's Amy, and their family grew up like 6 blocks from my parents. And I
Mm.
went all through kindergarten through high school with her older brother. She was 4 years younger than me. So at that time, she would have been almost 8 years younger than my brother Johnny. And I also had deduced that it wasn't my sister's, because I would have known if she was pregnant and gave up a child. And I considered my oldest brother Lou, but he was so much older because he's 8 years older than me. And that would have been a 12-year gap between him and Amy. So I knew it had to be Johnny to be the father.
Mm, how did you ended up reaching out?
I did. I reached out to Kyle through 23andMe because we were connected there. We were able to send each other direct messages. Well, I reached out and I didn't hear anything for a couple months. Actually, I didn't hear anything at all on 23andMe. So I started to cyber stalk him, because I wanted to know who this person was. And at that point, and he looked so much like my brother Johnny. It was like Johnny was alive again, because Johnny had been murdered in '98. And so I found his mom, Amy, through social media, and I reached out that way. And then she and I had a phone conversation one night, and that just opened up a whole new world for, actually, for both of us and for Kyle.
What do you mean by that? A whole new world?
Well, she had had one boyfriend at the time that she got pregnant with Kyle. She was 20 years old. She had had one boyfriend who she had been with a handful of times. And then she broke up with him because he had been abusive toward her. And her intention was to go into the US Navy. And during that process, they do blood tests, and she found out she was pregnant. So she assumed that it was this boyfriend ex-boyfriend at this point. And when she had Kyle in March of '98, she reached out to the ex-boyfriend for support, and they did a paternity test. It was negative. She was absolutely dumbfounded. She didn't know what, it was an oh shit moment for sure. And then she was kind of like, oh, wait a minute. I was out one night and had a couple of beers. She was out with a friend of hers who wanted to meet up with this guy who was a friend of Johnny's. So the 4 of them were out together at my brother's apartment. And she had remembered having a couple of beers and then blacking out, because she wasn't a drinker. And she woke up and didn't quite feel right, but didn't realize that he had drugged her and raped her. And that's when she realized, after the paternity test with her ex had failed, that she realized that Johnny had to have been the father, because that was the only other situation that she'd ever been in that would have caused a pregnancy. And then she didn't reach out to my brother because she kind of realized what happened. And what she was thinking the whole 27 years before I met her was she felt that she got drunk and she put herself in a situation and she blacked out after a couple of beers and had sex with some guy that she didn't know. And so she was like, well, I don't know him. I don't really want a relationship with him. And so she decided she'd just raise him on her own. And by the way, she did not go into the Navy because she was pregnant. The Navy wouldn't allow her.
Mm,
So it changed her entire life story. So when
dramatic.
I had reached out to her and, she's in Northern Kentucky, I'm in Kansas City, I'm reaching out, the sister of the guy who raped you. I mean, she was with her mom and her sister, and they had me on speaker for this conversation because she didn't know what she was going to get from me, and I didn't know what I was going to get from her either, right? And the whole conversation turned into this beautiful relationship between the two of us and with me and Kyle. And during the conversation, she was relaying the story about her interaction with my brother. And my brother was murdered in February of 98.
So
And
about 2 years after Kyle was born.
yeah. And so she just went all this time believing that she just got drunk and blacked out and had sex with some guy she didn't know. And, she had this shame. And I was quiet on the phone and listening to her tell me the story. And I just stopped her and I said, Amy, he raped you. He drugged you and raped you. She was like, well, and she was making all these excuses that so many women make about getting themselves in the wrong position, or I should have worn that, or just the things, the archaic
It's,
thoughts that
it's
go.
remarkable. Yeah, it's remarkable how we are wired, and I don't think it's hardwired, although there might be a little bit of that to it. But I
Right,
think we're wired by society to blame ourselves for our own trauma. And
right.
I
And
think
so I said to her, Amy, he drugged you and raped you. And she was like, well, he's not here to defend himself. And I'm like, trust me, I know my brother. I love my brother. We were estranged when he was murdered, but didn't lessen the pain. But it also didn't lessen that he was an asshole. I mean, I'm sorry to say it like that, but like he was he was not a good person. I mean, he didn't murder anybody, but he did some crimes, and I know my parents were always getting him out of trouble, including a time that he punched my lights out and I had it's a whole other story, but talk about unwinding family drama. But he had punched my lights out when I was in college and I had him arrested. And then my parents told me that if I went ahead with the charges, that they would kick me out of the house and they would pay for my college, which they were paying for my college at the time. So that just went away. But my brother did all these things and my parents were constantly bailing him out. And
what's what's the story behind your brother's murder?
well, if you were ever to have a conversation with my father, and he's passed away a couple years ago, but my father would never believe this. But my brother was making a drug deal. He was going to buy drugs for him and his girlfriend. And the guy who he was his drug dealer tried to rob him because even though we had no affluency whatsoever, our neighborhood seemed like we lived in the nicer part of town because he was in downtown Covington, Kentucky. And our neighborhood, which was, you know, 10 minutes outside of the downtown area, probably seemed like a more affluent area. And I guess in some sense it was compared to downtown. So he thought my brother was from money. And he wasn't. I mean, frankly, the money that he got to go buy the drugs, he bummed it off of my dad. And it was like a $20 deal. It was some crack. It wasn't a lot, but it was a $20 deal. And this guy, Donnell Gallagher, decided that he was going to rob my brother. And my brother just sort of laughed at him like, yeah, whatever, and went and got in his car. And Donnell Gallagher came over and shot him 2 times. And so my brother got out of the car and started stumbling and fell onto a fence in front of this house. And Donnell Gallagher proceeded to go through his pockets and take the other probably $20 that he had and took off. And it didn't take long for them to find out that it was him and some other circumstances, and he was charged and convicted.
One of the things that stuck out to me first time you started to share your story with me was that you really grew up in a home where violence, secrecy, racism, misogyny, and even emotional neglect were normal. And, one of the things that I remember thinking as we talked about it was that you really had sort of internalized the fear, hypervigilance, right? And that belief that love is conditional. And, you went on to sort of against the odds, build a stable, loving adult life, despite not necessarily because of your upbringing, but you carry a lot of grief, guilt, and sort of like a lifelong, ache for belonging that we wouldn't necessarily see if we just met you on a corner.
Right.
And, I felt like in our first few conversations about it, it was really clear you were getting to the point where you were beginning to understand the depth of what you survived. Could we step back and just talk a little bit about what it was like growing up?
Well, I think you're right about the fear and the neglect. Um, there was always fear, mostly fear. Um, my parents, my mom, who had 4 children, didn't like kids. So let's start there. She did not like kids, but she had 4 kids and she was very neglectful. My mom had undiagnosed depression, probably bipolar, probably something even more severe. Agoraphobia. She couldn't leave the house. It was too much for her. She was a screamer. She was a hitter. Um, and my dad did what he could to stay away from her. My dad worked for the railroad, so he was usually on the road for 48 hours and home for 24 and that cycle. And so when he was home, I gravitated toward him just to get away from my mom because she was just angry all the time. And they were of the generation, they were older parents when I was born. They were mid 40s when I was born, and they were of the generation that you don't get divorced. Um,
Right.
and you hear this, it's better to be from a broken home than to live in one. And I am the perfect testament for that. I would rather have not lived with the two of them together. They were always in separate bedrooms and they just could not stand each other. And mostly, my mom was just so angry all the time and so hateful. And all she did when in those 24 hours that my dad was home was complain and bitch and cry. And so the anxiety of knowing he was coming home, it was kind of twofold. I wanted him to come home because I wanted to see him and I wanted to have a
Yeah.
relief from my mom. But at the same time, I knew once he got home, it was
She would
just
get worse.
chaos. Oh, yeah, it was just going to be chaos. It was going to be,
That's a great example of how, like, when you grow up in, like you said, a broken home, like emotions don't become black and white. You think about sort of like the stereotypical father or mother goes on a trip and they're coming back and the kids are excited to have them there.
Mhm.
Or either mom or dad gets back from work and everybody's really, really excited. But for some of us or for some people, dad gets back from work and you hide under the bed and pay attention to the footsteps before
Right.
and for
Well,
you, it became a very mixed.
it was very mixed.
uh,
And my older siblings were always in trouble. They were all involved in drugs. I'm the first one of my parents' kids to graduate high school and go to college.
And you guys were growing up in the 1960s, 1970s, northern Kentucky, near or south of Cincinnati. Is that the right
Yes, we're
area?
in the greater Cincinnati area. I was born in 71, so I grew up in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
And I knew my siblings were always getting into trouble. My brother wrecked so many cars. And I knew that when my dad would get home from work and be home for those 24 hours, he would be cleaning up the messes that my siblings were involved in. And they would get in trouble and they would catch his wrath. But I didn't, because I didn't do anything bad. I was involved in sports and all these extra things, anything I could get involved in at school. So I didn't really do anything bad. I made pretty good grades and I did
So
my
for
work.
them, when dad was away, they could do whatever they wanted, but they also had to put up with your mom during that time period, but they could
Right.
get away with things.
Yeah.
So it
Yeah.
was very mixed for them.
And so I had to see his wrath, not directed at me, but I did have to witness his wrath against them, which is
Right.
also traumatic
Right.
because they would get beatings and I would often witness them. There was one where, I don't know, I was early teens, I'm sure. Johnny was out late and I have no idea exactly what happened. I just know that he got home really late after probably midnight. We always had to be in by 10 o'clock when the streetlights came on. He was out after midnight and my bedroom was kind of this common room. It's hard to explain. And so he was getting a beating. And so that's where my bedroom was, or my bed was in kind of this common room. And they came in, turned on the overhead lights. My brother had to pull down his pants, and my mom was whipping him with a belt, and he was screaming. And my dad was standing in the doorway, and I was awakened. This is what I woke up to. And I remember saying, "Dad, make her stop. Like, that's enough." And I didn't realize that she was being so mean to him. She was being mean to him, but she was actually protecting him a little bit because my dad was standing in the doorway holding an extension cord. And that's what he wanted to use on him. But she was just using the belt. So,
Wow.
yeah.
Wow. Er, Do, do I remember correctly that you told me that one of your sort of most consistent memories of your mom, other than raging, was just sitting crying, and there were ups and downs and
Mhm.
all around. I am, and you also, I think you had mentioned at one point, or at least at different points, there's been friction between all of the siblings, and there have been, did any of them stay close to your mom and your dad?
No, we've never stayed close to each other.
Mm.
I was close with my dad, but they didn't stay close with each other. My sister was, quote unquote, my dad's caretaker. But the reason she was my dad's caretaker when he was more elderly is because she had never really moved out of their house. She just kind of moved in this guy that, well, it's not her husband. It's a whole other story. She's married to some other guy, but she had moved in this guy and they had two kids together and they raised their kids in my dad's house, my mom and dad's house. And then my mom had passed away in 2008. Excuse me. Yes, 2008. And so she lived with my dad to take care of him, although
Mm.
he was fine. But she never worked. She quit high school in ninth grade. Um, and she had these two kids who she's managed to alienate. She has no relationship with her two children, Cheyenne and Noah. And Cheyenne has a 5-year-old daughter now, and my sister's never met her. And so that cycle has continued. And it's, my sister lived with my dad because she had no way of taking care of herself.
Do you know anything about the way that your parents grew up? Where they grew up, how they grew up, what their childhoods are like?
Um, yeah. So paternal grandparents, my paternal grandfather died when my dad was 13. And they had had 9 children, and 3 of them, my father, his older brother, and then 1 younger brother, were the only 3 to live to adulthood. The others were born in the 19 teens and 1920s, and for some reason or another, whether it was a stillbirth or some kind of disease when the children were early age, they had they were the only 3 remaining that lived to adulthood. And when my paternal grandfather passed away, my grandmother had remarried. And from what I understand, he was a very good man who my dad was close to. And then he had passed away. So my dad did have a strong woman in my grandmother who had lived through all of these children passing. And she was very religious. My dad grew up in Southeast Kentucky, Appalachia, and they were very Pentecostal, Bible Belt religious. My mom grew up in West Virginia, in Appalachia, and also in Eastern Kentucky. And her parents had split. And again, that generation did not believe in divorce. And my maternal grandfather had passed away at coal mines of black lung.
Right.
And my grandmother had taken my mom and her sister, she had 1 sister, to Detroit so she could get a job in a factory and support her daughters. And from what I understand from my maternal side, because the only grandparent I had known was my paternal grandmother, Sadie. I didn't know my maternal grandparents because the generation gaps were just so huge. From what I understood of my mother's upbringing was that her mom was the same as my mom, very spiteful, neglectful, just just kind of a nasty person, just sad all the time. So I know my mom had had a rough upbringing with her father passing and just kind of an angry, bitter, neglectful mother herself. And I'm sure with some depressive issues, some severe depressive issues. And there were times I recall my mom was known to sit at the kitchen table and just play solitaire with her cards, not on a phone like we do today. She had this old, worn out deck of cards that she would sit at the table and play solitaire. There were so many times that I would come in either from school or in the summer, coming in from the pool, and my mom would have her head laid down on the table and she would just be crying, just inconsolable. And so, being who I am, I would rush over to her and I'd try and give her a hug, and I would say, ask her why she was crying, and I wanted to help, and she would just push me away, like literally push me away. And I'm like, and all she would say is, through her crying and her tears, she would just say, "I'm just so sick. I'm just so sick." And I said, in my childlike ways, "If you're sick, mom, why don't you go to the doctor? And she would say, the doctors can't do anything for me. My kind of sickness, there's nothing for it. And this was in probably the late 70s,
Mm,
early 80s, when no one talked about depression. No one addressed it.
right.
She didn't actually come out and say, I'm depressed. What she said was, I'm sick, and the kind of sickness I have, there's no cure for it. There's nothing a doctor can do for me. And looking back, I don't believe that. Even in the late 70s and 80s, there were treatments, even though people still didn't talk about it. There were still ways that she could go and get help for her depression. But I don't know if it was stubbornness or her actual belief that there was nothing that could be done. And so she never went to the doctor.
You know, I want to ask you the same question that I asked Judith Patterson, which is, you know, you've built a loving life after being in all of this. And, you know, Judith's memoir, it's fundamentally about a woman returning to the ruins of her childhood, you
Mhm.
know. And in her case, a mother lost to alcoholism, a father who couldn't protect her, and sort of like a family system that sort of normalized dysfunction
Mhm.
and pain. What's the reason why a daughter would go back and excavate their childhood shaped by their parents' damage?
I don't think I've gone back and excavated it. I've always lived with it.
Mm,
I mean, there are plenty of times that I have absolutely tried to ruin my relationship with my husband, Greg. No doubt about it. I've tried to push him away. I've tried to say mean things, but he knows where I came from, and he was just so willing. I mean, we've been married almost 26 years, and he's so willing to stand by me. And I think the reason for this excavation, I guess, as you want to say, this exploration.
exploration. Yeah.
I mean, there's different ways of defining it. I think because we're empty nesters now. We have a daughter who will be a senior in college and a daughter who will be a sophomore in college. So over this past year that my youngest daughter had gone out to school and they were both gone, I did a lot of reflecting on how Greg and I both brought them up and how many times I could have just ruined their lives if I had been a little bit more like my mom or my sister or my maternal grandmother. And
It's,
don't get me wrong, there are definitely a lot of things that they could point out that they would do differently than me. Every daughter's like that with their mom.
mm-hmm.
Um, but I think I think the reason now that there's so much more exploration is because of my daughters. And I can't believe I absolutely have not blown apart their lives with tendencies that were always in the background of who I am.
Well, and that's a interesting element of it. I don't know if I've ever told you this or even shared this. But part of the reason why when I was younger I didn't want to have kids was I was very fearful that I would pass on some of
Mhm, mhm.
m- my mental illness or some of the damage that I carried. And, you know, one of the things that's just been very interesting over the course of life of learning about is intergenerational trauma. You know, and I think for me, it comes up often in conversations about, I think we have this tendency to want to start the clock at zero for everybody else, right? Like, as soon as you're born, everything that happened before that doesn't matter, but it does. And
Mhm.
it matters what happened, you know, a century ago or more in your family. And I think, you know, one of the fears that some people have is that they are, and from what you're saying, it sounds like you may fit in this bucket, that before they have kids or even when they have their children, they're afraid they're going to pass on um, the things that came from their own trauma, that they're
Yeah.
going to pass that on.
Yeah,
H-
for sure.
how did you think about that as you were thinking about having kids and as a mother?
Well, when Greg and I got married, and we were married a few years, and we started having the conversation about having kids, and I said, I don't know that I really want to have kids. Kind of afraid of having kids, kind of the same way that you put it. And he was like, kids is part of the deal. They're part of the deal. We're going to have kids. You're a great person. Um, I'm here with you. And thank God his parents, my in-laws, are both angels on earth, that I had them as guides, especially my mother-in-law. So I had them as guides. I also didn't have the influence, directly influenced from my parents, because I was so far away in Kansas City. So I could take them to visit, but and they could see where I grew up, and they could see what things were like. But, you know, my mom would try to be on her best behavior with my kids around and not be too much, right?
Hopefully
So,
not mocking their tenderness as she did with you.
oh gosh, she's so horrible. Um, she did not mock their tenderness. Um, I can't imagine mocking the tenderness of my child.
No, I can't either.
I mean,
But
I embraced it and just loved her, loved both of my girls even more for their tenderness, not mocked it and made fun of it and gave them, nicknames.
do you think that could be an outgrowth of your own experience? Sort of like the opposite side of it, right? We fear we're going to pass it on, but then for some of us or for some people, the exact opposite happens. It becomes
Right.
the example of what we're not going to be.
Right. I definitely reined that in with my kids. Um, my sister did not. And again, she has no relationship with her kids.
I
And
wanted to, I wanted to ask you something.
yeah,
Do you, just in listening to everything you said so far, do you feel like there was ever a moment in your childhood where someone set aside their needs for yours?
no,
Mm,
friends' parents, but, how does your friend's parents set aside their needs for me, right? But not in my nuclear family. No, not a sibling, not my parents.
that's wild.
Like, my mom didn't go to my graduations. My mom didn't come to my wedding.
Do you think that's part of the reason why you had mentioned earlier that you push Greg away at times? Like that there is a fear of intimate and vulnerable connection because,
Yeah, I think I would always try and push him away before he pushed me away. Before he was gone, before he
I,
took off.
well, I think one of the things when you grow up in an environment where safety and love feel conditional, um, affection becomes unpredictable, right? So if somebody comes to me, just given the family that I grew up with, and they say, Jason, I love you, or whatever it is, I take that to the bank, right? It's
Oh,
gold.
yeah.
But I think for many of us, when you grow up in those conditional environments, um, affection is unbelievably unpredictable. And so it makes it so much harder to believe it when you receive it.
Right. The security, and not only the security of having a home, because we always knew that we would have a home. My dad was a very good provider, but the security of whether or not my mom was going to leave. She was always threatening to leave. Um, and she would openly say, I would say, ask, am I going to come with you? And she would always say, no, I can't take care of you. Um, and so that attachment was never there. And I don't think it was ever there for her, because it's hard for me to have an attachment to her if she refuses to have attachment to me.
Right. And if she hasn't experienced that kind of attachment, one of the most striking things I think about just in listening to you in this conversation, you describe your mom almost with a sort of dual consciousness. You love your mother, you're furious at your mother, you mourn your mother, you try to understand your mother. Like, you love your
Very
father.
sad for my mother
Yeah.
because we were funny kids. We could be very funny. And she never found any joy in us. I was the goofiest kid ever. And she never found any joy in that. And I'm sad. And I was involved in so many things, and especially with sports. Played softball, I played golf, I was on the color guard flag team. I mean, I did all these things and I had so much fun doing all these things. And she never was involved. She never came to watch. She never rooted me on. And not only with that, but just even with schoolwork. And that's so sad to me that she never found joy in her kids growing. She never found joy in reading books to us or watching our brains and our bodies grow and expand and learn new things. She was more jealous than anything. She was more bitter about anything that I accomplished, and she showed it.
Mm.
Like not
You know, I
coming to graduation. She was mad at me that day. I couldn't understand. Mom, why aren't you, as graduating high school, Mom, why aren't you coming? Because I'm mad at you right now. Like,
it almost seems like an absurd reason to not go to something for your kid.
right,
You can be as mad as you want at them.
right. And, when my girls, we would sit and read books to them, or we would take them somewhere and, to a park or to a farm or something, just anything that we took them to. And just sitting back and watching them flourish and do all these fun things and be goofy and laugh and dance. That was so much joy for me to watch that. And I felt that at the same time that I would have this joy in the back of my mind, I had this sadness for my mom that she never engaged in that joy.
Never experienced that. And I think you're getting at like the very difficult question that when you grow up in an environment that's dysfunctional, how do you hold love and truth in the same hand?
Hold hurt and
Hold
love.
love and truth in the same hand.
Right, right. As well as holding love and hurt in the same
Mm.
hand and bitterness and joy in the same hand. I mean, there's so many analogies we can make there, but to,
Maybe excavation is the wrong word, actually. Maybe it's reclamation.
yeah, maybe. I guess haven't quite defined it myself. So I don't have a pretty good vocabulary, I think, being a former writer, but I think I need to read a little bit more to
No one's ever a former
find
writer.
the right words.
No one's ever a former writer. It's just always to name. It's always
Maybe I'll
harder to
ask
name what's happening with ourselves.
maybe I'll ask AI and see what I can get from there. I'm
The
not by the way. But, I think I've always had sort of a lifelong I think the journey to healing is always gonna be there throughout the rest of my life. That's for sure.
oh yeah, it's like a
Right.
Mobius strip. There's no off that ride. You just got to keep on driving.
Right. And so I don't know, I think that, I've ruined plenty of relationships, especially with, female friends. Um, but I think trying to maybe mend those friendships, because I know my mom didn't have friends. And I think maybe mending those friendships and, um, continuing my good place with Greg. Thank God. I mean, the guy, I don't know how he's put up with me, honestly, all this time. Um, but he just has just been so steadfast and like, that's not how you live. You don't live leaving each other. Um, and so I've learned so much from him and from his family about true connections and love
Even that basic notion that that's what love does, right? Like
and just
it
belonging and acceptance and dedication. Learned so much of that from them. And they've been great role models for my daughters. My daughters are very close with my in-laws. And I'm so glad that they've had that opportunity to learn and also unlearn some of the things that they lived with through their upbringing by me. You know, all girls, almost all girls want to do things differently and be differently from their mom. Hopefully my girls will come around and go, she wasn't so bad. Um, but having my mother-in-law Anne in their lives and continue to be in their lives has just been such a blessing. Um,
what do you
yeah, just we also have a very strong Catholic faith, and I haven't talked much about that, but that has also been a very stabilizing force in our lives, not
tell
only
me
for
more about
us, but also
more
for
about tell me more about that.
well, we didn't have any kind of beliefs growing up. I mean, the closest I would say is Pentecostal, but my parents didn't attend church and didn't take us to church, so we kind of sort of left out in the wind on our own. And when I was in my mid-20s, I always knew that I had believed in Jesus and that I had a longing for an attachment to something beyond this world. And I became Catholic when I was in my mid-20s. And the structure and the love that is there through Catholicism has it's right where I need to be. It's right where I've always needed to be. It's what I've always needed. Not
Well,
that
the idea of unconditional love, right?
oh, absolutely. And it provides me with the structure that I needed, not just in I needed the structure in terms of believing in someone, but also someone believing in me. Because Jesus is always there for you. And I didn't know that much about Christianity or Catholicism when I was growing up. I was always drawn to Catholicism, but I didn't know anything about it. And without parents, when you're a kid, without parents to take you to church or introduce you to any religion, kind of on your own. And I sought that out in my mid-20s. And then we raised our girls Catholic.
One story you told me stuck out to me, and I wanted to ask you about it. You had told me, that your father had generally been protective of you when it came to your mother, but he had been, you know, and you had said this earlier, you'd seen him be brutal to your siblings. But
Mhm,
one story with your sister, when she found out she was pregnant by a teen who was half Vietnamese and half
mhm,
Black. And your father, I think you said, hated both of those races.
mhm.
And, you know, he had told you if you had brought someone Black home using a very different word for it, he would kill either of you.
Yeah.
And, you know, she got pregnant and he beat her, I think, you said until her eyes were swollen shut and her
Mhm,
face was bruised and bloodied. And then your parents sent her away to Texas, right? To
mhm. At the time, my oldest brother and his then wife were living in Texas, in
go
Dallas.
living there. And, you know, I was thinking about, your oldest brother, Lou, and Johnny, and you, and your sister, Sandra. And you're sort of the one who got away from it, got
Right.
away in a way that the others didn't. What do you think made the difference? And do you, yeah, what do you think made the difference in
Well
thinking about your very different journeys? What kind of feelings do you have associated with that?
well, I think I always saw them getting in trouble, and I was so afraid of getting in trouble and getting meeting that wrath. So that was one thing. I also have a very close friend who she's been one of my closest friends since, like, 3rd grade. I would spend a lot of time at their house. I spent a lot of time at Patty's house, and they set sh her mom and stepdad set a lot of boundaries for me, and I had a lot of protection from them on and sort of guidance on what's right and wrong. And but I know it was instilled I don't know, it wasn't instilled in me by my parents, I don't think, but I think more from Patty's parents of right and wrong. And I just always knew that I would go to high school and graduate and go to college and have a career and maybe someday get married and have kids and buy a house, just all the regular things that I felt like you were supposed to do. And I'm not exactly sure where that came from, but that was just never a question in my mind to drop out of high school at any age or to do drugs, um, or to smoke cigarettes or to be violent with people. That just, I don't know. It's just something different in me. I don't exactly know where it came from.
Well, I think it also, part of it kind of illustrates that idea. They always talk about in health, particularly in mental health, you have to study two twins to sort of see the differences. And I just think our behaviors, are driven by our personalities, they're driven by our motives, they're driven by the differences of our experiences. And they're always so complex, right? Because even none of us, even though we're part of the same family, none of us are having the exact same experience.
Right.
We're not going through it um, the same way. The trauma that was passed down through your mother, for example, hit you all very differently. And I think sometimes we attribute that to character. Sometimes part of it's character, some of it's timing, some of it's, you know, what's fragile or what's strong in each of us. Um, and, you know, you, I can think of a lot of people that I know that, you know, where they've had enormous amounts of trauma that generations ago was passed on, and then gets passed down. And then at some point, someone in the cycle decides, enough. I'm not going to do this to my kids.
Right. I've had many conversations about cycles that my siblings and I have had witnessed growing up. I've had many conversations about that with my sister. And she never broke that cycle. She still hasn't broken that cycle. And I don't understand that because one of the things that she and I would talk about that I would try and say to her, and 13 months younger, or I'm 13 months younger than her. And, I'm always the little sister. And so taking advice from your little sister was not the thing that was going to happen between us. But one of the things that I would say to her was, you can stop making bad decisions right now. Like, let all the other bad things that you've done or all the stupid things that you've done or said, let that go. And then just stick with trying to not do those things again. And I know it's easier said than done, but when I eat 5 or 6 Girl Scout cookies and my stomach starts to hurt and I go, I probably shouldn't have done that. Maybe I won't do that again.
Yeah, because you
But
could keep on eating
learn
them.
mistakes. So maybe the next time I have Girl Scout cookies, I'm not going to have 6 of them. Maybe I'll just have 1 or 2.
You know,
I'll still have the Girl Scout cookies, but maybe I won't take it so far.
it's interesting. So, when you look at trauma psychology, family systems theory, things like that, and then these longitudinal studies that they do on resilience, they often say that like the big difference between sort of children who break the cycle and those who repeat it comes down to like a small set of factors. And will is a part of it, but the conditions are a part of it. The supports are a part of it. And I think what you're describing there, sort of that idea of internal shifts that happen
Mhm.
to us. Like usually what I would look for is, okay, somewhere there was somebody in your life where you had a tuned, stable relationship, like a teacher, a neighbor, a coach, a parent's friend, and you mentioned your friend's parents. But that ability to sort of like you're just saying right there, to observe yourself, to step outside and recognize like what I'm doing doesn't make sense is the same skill that lets you realize, I think, when you're dealing with the abuse, that this isn't normal or I don't want to be like this. And it becomes a wedge sort of like between you and repeating the cycle. And, you know, for a lot of people, they get some kind of access to a different kind of world. But another thing that's so crystal clear about you too, in addition to that idea of like being able to stand outside yourself, is you have emotional literacy. And that's one of the things that I personally have noticed in people who break the cycle. They can name feelings. They can live in discomfort. Like they can regulate their impulses a little bit better
Mhm.
and reflect.
Not about regulating impulses.
Yeah.
I mean, I've definitely, I haven't lived a perfect life. I haven't been kind to a lot of people in my life because, when you're hurt, you're a lot of the anger that comes out toward other people is that appears to be anger really isn't anger, but it's hurt. And I guess, Jason, I'm not really sure where I'm going here, but I I've definitely made a lot of bad decisions in my life. And so what I'm saying is that what I've tried to do is go, okay, I'm not going to make that decision again. Like I talked about with the cookies. Um, and I haven't always
Well,
had.
you know what? An interesting thing there, like the cookies example, you're recognizing that it's actually a choice, right? So, like, every time someone decides not to hit their child, it's a choice. Every time somebody decides to go to therapy, it's a choice. Refusing to repeat a pattern is a choice, right?
Right.
And I think that's an
But
important
I,
piece that you don't feel powerless. You
right.
feel like you
But
have a choice.
we, I definitely have impulse issues. Um,
I can relate.
um, you know, borderline personality, just the impulse where I know something's wrong and I still do it. And then I look back and go, oh God, what was I thinking? And then, oftentimes you have that impulse and you do it again. I mean, it could be with alcohol or cookies or being mean to my husband or being mean to a friend or saying something wrong or doing something wrong in a social situation. And like it's part of that it's part of that moment that you realize that you're hurt, that in order to protect myself, I have to outwardly act out.
It's interesting. I once asked a psychiatrist I really like, what is it with the fact that so many kids that grow up in violent or emotionally volatile households, why do they, why are they so impulsive? And what he said to me was interesting. He said they develop survival wiring and there's no time to develop planning wiring.
Mm,
And I thought that was a really, really interesting
yeah.
thing, because if you grow up in an environment, your roles do have to change day to day. Like,
Right.
things are inconsistent, right? Um, and I wonder whether there's some of that in there.
Oh, definitely. I really wish I had that planning wiring. Wish I could tap into that um, more. I mean, I own a business. I run a business, um, but I still would like to have more of that planning wiring in my brain, um, where that's
Well, an
right
interesting,
with my
an interesting, yeah. Well, an interesting thing that I just thought of is, I had a guest recently on talking about attachment theory, and one of the things that we know about impulse control and how it's learned in a child is if they have a caregiver who sort of helps regulate them, right? Soothes them, names feelings, models calm, helps
Mhm.
them with the downshift, right? Helps
Right.
them learn the lessons.
One of the things that my mom, she bragged about the dumbest stuff. She It was summertime. I was in a playpen back when they were called playpens. I don't know what they're called now. It's this big square playpen, and I was probably around a year old, and it was the summer, and we didn't have air conditioning in our house, and everyone was out in the yard except me. I'm in the playpen, and somehow she didn't realize they locked themselves out of the house, and so I was inside hanging out in my playpen, just playing with whatever toys were in there, and I didn't notice that anyone was gone. And then my mom helped my brother, like, hoist him up, opened a window. He got in and unlocked the door. And she was just so pleased that, see, you didn't need anybody. You just got along just fine. Well, it's probably because I had never had anyone paying any attention to me. And of course I was fine. She was one of those people who didn't believe that if a baby was crying, you should pick him up. You should, you know, let him cry it out. Well, we all know babies cry for a multitude of reasons, but it was her belief that you just let them cry it out. Well,
Hmm.
I guess I just became used to that. Mm, they're not here. Okay, I'll just play with my. And she was just so pleased. She loved to tell that story. Oh, Sadie was in her playpen for a couple of hours while we were locked out of the house, and she was just fine. I don't think I'd be proud of that.
No, not
I'd
at
be
all.
mortified.
No,
I mean,
not.
granted, they were right outside the house and they were trying to get in, and, if something happened, they would just break the window and crawl through, but, they just jimmied open a window and got in, but I thought, that is not something I would have that's not one of the stories I would be proud of.
Right. One of the things for me, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap up, but one of the things that really stands out related to you is that, you're a woman who grew up in a family that was really marked by things like violence, secrecy, racism, emotional neglect. Yeah. Somehow you managed to carve out a life that's defined by love, relative stability, and integrity. And you really survived a childhood where nobody protected you. Siblings were harmed or lost to death in your brother's case. And loyalty to the family really sort of like I don't know. What was it? It meant silence. And then as an adult, you built a marriage, raised daughters, created a business, reclaimed your own narrative. And there's something so beautiful about that. I remember somebody once saying to me, they were like, Jason, it's kind of amazing how resilient you are. And I was like, but I started from 90 by having the family that I grew up in, right? So I had unconditional love. I had all these things. So you see me as resilient, but I started with a lot in the tank already. And there's just something so powerful of you being able to transform inherited trauma into clarity, connection, and a really hard won sense of yourself, one that is honest about yourself. And I wanted to give you just a chance to share any kind of closing thoughts that you have, but I wanted to leave you with that thought from my perspective.
Well, that is very gracious of you to say those things, and I still have a lot of work to do. I still have a lot of work to see that and to act with it, with grace and with compassion and without hurting other people, because I know I still do. Um, but definitely deep down, I have I have a lot of love for people. I still have that love for my family. I still miss my brother. I still miss my mom. I wish there were things that I could have done to either help them make different decisions or to make them feel better, to make them know that they were loved. But they were not accepting of that. And and that is not only neglect, that's downright turning you away. And that's where a lot of my hurt comes from, is the turning away when I know that a lot of things can be solved with love. And I wish that I could have been able to do more to let them know that they were loved. And there wasn't. There wasn't anything I could do because it takes that person to open up and let go. And I hope that I can continue on this path that I've definitely been on for a few years now, where I can, you know, ask forgiveness from those that I've hurt and to just continue to love my kids and my husband,
Mhm.
our family and our friends, and let go of those things that I can't do for others. I
Yeah.
can't do anything for my siblings to make them love me or to make them accept me. Um, but I can just do what I do for who will accept it.
Yeah. What advice would you have for other people who are sort of like walking in your shoes, like for the younger you, the 5-year-old, 10-year-old, 12-year-old?
I knew you were going to ask me this question, um, and I'm totally not prepared because I don't know. I think just believing in yourself, because when I was that age, I knew who I was. I knew that who I wasn't, and I just believed that I was going to make it. And you have to do that in order to make it. Reading and escaping in books was such a blessing for me. And I think, trying to tell a kid to read more, they just roll their eyes at you. But really, when you can get into a book and just escape and and believe that you can be those characters who can have it all, just believe that in yourself. Don't listen to what other people say. Don't listen to the names that people use, the nicknames they use for you. Don't, and it's hard to push that away, but it's hard to push those thoughts down, but just, you have to believe that you're worth, you have worth.
Mm, yeah, that's beautiful. I think you have a book in you, my friend.
Well, we're thinking about that. I don't know if
Yeah.
we want all, I don't know if anybody would be able to stand my untangling of my family. And
Mm.
I mean,
I
I
think
I
I
wish
think
I could
what
write it in a way that it could be a comedy.
I think what you would find if you were able to untangle it yourself in a way to write it, that there are a lot of other people who would pick up that book and see themselves.
Good God, I don't know if anybody open up my brain and let people see in. That might scare the daylights out of people. But, thank you. But I do wish I could write it in a way that there is comedy, but I don't know that there is, because so many of my stories, there is no way to add comedy to some of these stories. There just isn't. And
Yeah.
so, maybe just writing it with compassion and reminding people to keep compassion and love and forgiveness is a way for them to see my stories and associate their lives with them and see that they can get through their own with love and with compassion and forgiveness.
You know, a very interesting thing about your whole story is that you didn't have unconditional love growing up, but look at what you gave them. Look at what you gave your sister, your brothers, your mom, your dad.
Yeah. And my sister and my brother who were still living still just pushed me away.
Yeah. But that's the
And that's
thing about
sad.
love.
Yeah. And that's sad, but it just makes me love my kids and my husband more, those who are willing to accept it. It just makes me
It's the
have
thing about unconditional love. It doesn't matter when you unconditionally love someone how they feel about it, whether they're mad about it, whether they want to push it away. It's there. It's unconditional. It exists no matter what. And
right.
you gave it to them.
I
You
still
gave
do.
them an
I
example.
still don't. It's like they can't see it.
Well, that's okay. That part's okay. All we can do is give it.
Yeah.
If you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you guys all again soon.